Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in today's episode, we have two things going on that I love. The first is we have this thing that's starting to happen that seems to be the DC version of Marvel's big Civil War event. And then zooming in on that idea even more, we see Steve Trevor has been reborn as a superhero named Patriot, which was inspired by Wonder Woman Volume 1, issue number 174, where in that issue, Steve Trevor was given the powers of Wonder Woman and he became a superhero named Patriot. So this episode revisits the oldest love triangle on Earth K, and we finally get some answers and we see some interesting outcomes. But before we get into that, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and leave a comment. That helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love to hear from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, all that said, let's dive in. The prologue to today's story takes place in the dimension called Earth K in 550 BC when Diana is born. We get that date from the old Linda Carter TV show, by the way. Something else that we borrowed from them is the idea that Diana's powers come from the costume, which will come into play later when Steve Trevor gets his own costume, allowing him to become Patriot. Anyway, so let me set the stage for that first. So, the time of the Celtic pantheon came to an end, and the guy that the Irish referred to as the Dagda wandered the earth, searching for a new purpose. And his odyssey brought him to the shores of Themyscira, aka Paradise Island, where he met Princess Diana. And on Earth K, we say that Diana is the daughter of an Amazon named Hippolyta, and that her dad is actually Prince Sextus Tarquinius, who was the last prince of Rome before they switched over to an empire. The Imperials of that time were hunting down anyone who might have a legitimate claim to the throne. So Hippolyta was ultimately forced to flee Rome. She and her fellow Amazons ended up on Paradise Island, which was surrounded by the mists of eternal youth. So when the ship of the Amazons sailed through the mists, now they gained the ability that they would never die of old age, right? They had unaging. And the same holds true for anyone else who sails to Paradise Island. Anyway, so Diana grows up on Paradise Island, but is curious about the outside world. And on the old Linda Carter TV show, that version of Wonder Woman would often name drop famous historical figures that she had met through the centuries. So we went with that and said that Diana and the man called Dagda had traveled together for years and years and years, and they had become lovers, right? They were very, very in love back then. And eventually their travels took them to the Roman Colosseum, where they encountered the Eternals from Marvel. Diana blamed one of them for what he had done to her mother years earlier. And so Diana fought the Eternals and eventually won. But the bigger takeaway from that encounter was that she found out that Athena of the Eternals was not actually a goddess at all, right? And that caused Diana to lose her faith. And she needed time to sort out everything that was going through her head. Complicating things was the fact that Dagda was called a god by the Irish, right? But he wasn't a god either. He was a genetically engineered being created by the old ones to fight a war for them that they eventually lost interest in. Dagda's creators abandoned him, and he'd been wandering the universe in search of a purpose ever since that war ended. And he thought he had finally found it in the arms of Diana, right? But this parallel between him and Thena was really bothering Diana. And so she told him that she needed space to think. But there was a misunderstanding in that moment where Arthur thought it was permanent breakup, right? So he left. And and by the way, over the years, as in his many travels, he was known by a lot of different names, right? Shakespeare called him Oberon, the Geats called him Beowulf, and Camelot called him King Arthur, the once and future king. And eventually, Arthur and Diana are reunited in World War II when FDR drafts all of the world's superhuman characters into one team called the All-Star Squadron. And their mission was to fight the Axis powers. But also fighting in World War II is Steve Trevor, an American soldier who, in my humble opinion, Wonder Woman's creator, William Moulton Marston, created to sort of represent everything that Marston and his two female lovers disagreed with. At the very least, that's kind of how we've always portrayed Steve on Earth K, right? That he was a product of that era, both the good and the bad. In Steve's defense, he was willing to lay down his life for the greater good, right? He bled in the trenches with his fellow soldiers, and Diana saw those positive qualities in him. But she also, in her mind, was sort of seeing what men could be, right? But that said, this was also the same Steve Trevor that would tell Diana Prince, right, in the secret identity with the glasses on and all that, he would call her ugly. He would tell her that maybe a shorter skirt would help with that face of hers, you know? Those moments have bothered a ton of comic book fans for decades. It is very easy to focus on that and overlook Steve Trevor's good qualities. And and like I've said before, we've been playing this game since I was 9 years old. And when I was 9 years old, for sure, me and all of my friends, everybody at that time that was playing the game, we all had a crush on Linda Carter, right? And when we would watch the show and we would see Steve Trevor, we all hated him, right? Because we were jealous. I'm not saying that's right or anything. Like I said, I was 9. That would have been the 80s. It was a different time, you know. By the way, I'm sure that Lyle Wagner is probably a nice guy in real life. I could do a whole thing on Lyle Wagner, but that's kind of outside of the scope of this particular video. Okay, so getting back to the the plot. So Steve Trevor had crash landed on Paradise Island. He was trying to warn the United States about the upcoming attack on Pearl Harbor, and Diana brought him back to America. But more than that, right, is that the Florence Nightingale effect was in play, where Diana had nursed Steve back to health and had developed feelings for him, right? So all of that is in play when she runs into Dagda in Europe. And and by the way, in 1941, none of those soldiers had ever heard the name Dagda, right? So the thing that he was better known for was King Arthur. So that's what everybody would have been calling him. You know, when he explains all these names he's gone by, that's the one that sticks out, right? That's the one that they're like, "Oh my God, you're King Arthur?" And you think about the Golden Age and all the crazy stuff going on in the Golden Age. that was the level. They'd meet Namor the Submariner and be like, holy crap, you're from Atlantis? Atlantis is real? There would be so much of that stuff going on that it's a perfect fit, actually. And the other thing that's very interesting about that moment in time is that when I say people are calling him King Arthur, I mean, part of that is the British in World War II, right? Because if you think about it, Arthur was said that he would return in Britain's darkest hour. And when the character in our game shows up, it's during the Blitz on London, right? So a ton of people did think that was Britain's darkest hour. And so now let's go back to Diana for a minute. She's not only is she emotionally invested in Steve Trevor, she has not seen Arthur literally in ages, right? And then on top of everything else, now there's all of this talk about his destiny as the once and future king, right? While Steve Trevor was human. And this aspect is really important. And I feel like it's always been too understated in our game. When Diana was in a trench with Arthur, right? Arthur knew that there were people suffering elsewhere, and he could not turn that off, right? Arthur was always in hero mode. Steve Trevor never had superpowers. He knew his limits. And when he was in the trenches, he would ease that tension with jokes, right? He could turn it off. And while Diana herself had been on several of these kind of Ray Harryhausen style adventures, nothing had prepared her for the horrors that the Axis powers unleashed in the 1940s. In her limited travels, she'd never seen anyone stoop to the level that the Fuhrer had, right? And deep down, Steve Trevor wanted away from all of that madness, right? But the way that Arthur was wired, he was driven to hunt these guys down even after the war, right? Like when they fled to Argentina. He had to do something about the boys from Brazil so that these atrocities were never repeated. And again, it's not our Steve Trevor, because God knows there's been a million interpretations of Steve Trevor over the years. But it's not that our version of Steve Trevor didn't care. He just knew his limits, right? But Arthur, honestly, doesn't. He will work himself into oblivion as long as there are people in need. And so several things come into play here. One is, like we see in the George Perez run on Wonder Woman in 1987, Diana has a certain innocence about her. And we decided that the Diana of Earth K needed some downtime after World War II. You know, even the old Linda Carter TV show depicted Wonder Woman as returning to Paradise Island. And even in the 1970s, she was still talking about how disturbing World War II had been, right? One might even argue that she had PTSD. Anyways, so Arthur still going after these guys after the war is over wasn't really helping his case when it comes to winning over Diana, right? Also, Steve Trevor was flawed, right? While Arthur felt kind of like Mr. Right. Or another way to put it is Arthur felt too much like Diana, right? Like both of them are royalty, both were superhuman, and committing to Arthur would, on some level, be a surrender to that idea of destiny that I was talking about earlier, right? That if he's going to be a king, that means she was going to be the queen, right? And so we're saying that that was too much. It was too serious. It was too soon, right? Diana thought she could have a nice time with Steve, no pressure. Also, in her mind, the relationship she had with Steve represented like Amazon human relations, basically. But Arthur was cut from the same cloth as her. So there's no um you're losing the diplomacy in that one. You know what I mean? So while Steve represented change, Arthur felt like more of the same. And Diana thought that she could fix Steve. I mean, that's honestly why she came to the world of man, was to teach them how the Amazons do things, right? So that's built into the character, right? But she kind of feels like she can't fix Arthur. You know what I mean? Because again, they're already so similar. And last but not least, William Moulton Marston made it very clear that Diana was dominant, and Arthur is too. But Steve would do anything for Diana, right? Anything. So there's that. So Diana is with Steve in 1945. Arthur respected her decision, and again, he walks away, right? But again, Diana doesn't like that. She sees it as Arthur isn't fighting for her, you know? And again, they have this misunderstanding thing that keeps happening, and there is hurt on both sides. And so before too awful long ago in our game's timeline, Diana is pregnant, right? And she has a baby girl who in classic DC Comics is known as Fury, aka Hippolyta Lita Trevor. And in our game world, we also gave Lita a twin sister named Stephanie Stevie Trevor, which, by the way, we stole that from John Byrne's Generations comic book series. So then, next in the timeline comes the Korean War, and Steve Trevor dies, which is also an idea we ripped off from Generations. But the point is that Diana then remembers Steve through rose tinted glasses. She remembered him as the dashing pilot and the war hero who paid the ultimate price for his country, right? And he was cut down before the culture clash of the 1960s. Where if he had not been cut down and the 60s happened and all of that stuff happened, surely Diana's opinion of him was bound to change, right? She would have seen him as maybe like jingoistic and chauvinistic and certainly opposed to all of those changes that came with the 60s, right? Diana raised her twin girls on Paradise Island. They grew up and they took turns as the new Wonder Woman in the Bronze Age. And when we saw Diana in the 1980s, now she was Queen Diana. We never actually said what happened to her mother, but whatever it was, Diana's adventuring days, for the most part, seemed to be behind her. Every day was now about duty and the weight of the crown. And her daughters both end up working for the IADC, which was the government agency we saw in the later seasons of the Linda Carter TV show. But they also work for Maxwell Lord as members of Justice League Europe and Justice League International, respectively. And because of this, Diana has dealings with Max Lord too. And what nobody realizes is that he's been using his psionic abilities. So throughout the 1990s, we see Diana get more and more dark, as was the trend of a lot of the 90s comic books that were trying to be overly edgy and grim dark and stuff like that. Anyways, then in the 2000s, the darker Diana, finally snaps the neck of Maxwell Lord, something that she never would have done in the past because he was bringing out the darkness deep down in her, right? And when she does that, by the way, she does it on American soil. So President George W. Bush tells the military to detain her, and she turns herself in. But then her fellow Amazons hear about this. They don't like that. So they invade the United States and take her back to Themyscira. So Bush calls in a superhuman who has been faithfully serving America since World War II and fought in every single war since then, right? And that's Arthur. Bush sends Arthur to Themyscira, and when Arthur gets there, the Amazons are on high alert. They lasso him and they ask him why he's there. He tells them that Bush sent him, and they end up placing him in the same dungeon where they used to contain Ares. And Diana comes to visit him. Initially, she's bitter. He says he never thought he would see the day when Diana would snap someone's neck. And she says that she never thought she would see the day when Arthur would invade Paradise Island. And he says he didn't come to fight. And she's still bitter. And she still feels like he didn't fight for her in 1945 and that he abandoned her at the end of World War II, just like he abandoned her in Rome, right? That's her perspective on it. She has centuries of hurt in her heart. So he tells her to use the lasso on him, and she does. And for the first time, she hears his side of everything. And they both end up feeling like all of that pain and all of those years of agony were over simple misunderstandings. And so they hooked up. And Arthur comments that it feels like coming home. And she feels the same way. And they've gone full circle, which, by the way, brings Diana back to those ideas about destiny, right? That scared her so much when she was younger. But now she's finally getting comfortable with it. And while she liked that Steve was kind of a bottom, and she enjoyed the power dynamics with that, now she enjoys Arthur's strength. And she wouldn't mind having a king in her life to share the burden of the crown with, right? Diana was ready for it now because Queen Diana is a very different person than Princess Diana was. She's changed. And she's not done changing because Arthur tells her that snapping necks doesn't seem like she's being herself. And she says maybe he can help her get rid of all that darkness that Max drudged up within her, right? And so for years now, those two have been in love and things have been going pretty good. And that brings us to the main plot of today's game session. In 2025, Excalibur was briefly destroyed, and so too was the barrier between the land of the living and the land of the dead. All the dead heroes and villains walked the earth once more in 2025, and one of them is the Patriot, aka Steve Trevor, who has been dead since the 1950s. He's a fish out of water who has no idea what a cell phone is, or the internet, or any of that. And as far as he's concerned, Diana still belongs to him. And in the mind of Steve Trevor, he didn't die for his country just to see some fairy king with 1,000 names conquer the world. And he sure as hell is not going to stand by and let this guy have his wife. And now those rose tinted glasses come off, right? And all of Steve Trevor's flaws are on full display. The outdated chauvinism, the jealousy, the bitterness, and Steve refuses to acknowledge that Diana has moved on. He's possessive and he hates Arthur more than ever. And Diana sees clearly what she could not see before. Steve Trevor was never her soulmate. It's Arthur who endured through the centuries, and it's Arthur who can stand by her side as her equal. So when Steve Trevor punches Arthur through a wall, Diana punches Steve in the other direction. Steve frames this as betrayal. He says, you loved me once, you swore yourself to me, and now you're kneeling to this king from the stars. Diana frames it as growth. She's like, I loved you then, but it was a different time. I grieved you when you died, but I moved on. And I'm not going to go backwards into that old era, you know? And Patriot tries to claim that Arthur is unworthy, just another conqueror. Diana argues back that the real contrast is that Steve wanted Diana to fit into his mold, while Arthur stands beside her as an equal. So Steve makes it dirty, literally hitting Arthur below the belt. And Diana puts Steve down clean and decisively, but without any cruelty. And her final statement to him is that she's not angry at Steve, but she is done with him. And as far as the onlookers go, everyone sees Diana reject Steve, so no one can try to spin it as like divided loyalty or something like that. And for Arthur, this closes a really old wound. You know, um, he never understood why she chose Steve over him. And now he finally sees that she didn't pick Steve because Steve was better, right? She picked Steve because that's what she needed at that stage of her life. And for Steve, his resurrection is tragic. He wasn't brought back for love or redemption. He feels like he was brought back to be the embodiment of the past that Diana has moved on from. And that brings us to our epilogue. Diana takes what's left of the Patriot costume back to Paradise Island, where she burns it. She gives Arthur a sad smile, and Arthur says he gets now why Diana chose what she chose in 1945. And Diana sums it all up by saying he was the wrong man at the right time. They hug. Their mood is low from the day's events. Elsewhere, Steve Trevor wakes up in the old Arrow cave. Green Arrow asks him how he's feeling, and Steve says, angry. Ollie says, that's good. We can use that. Steve Trevor looks around and he sees other supers here, guys like Manchester Black and Magog. Steve asks, "What's going on?" Green Arrow says they are the outsiders, and they're not just going to roll over and take this. They're going to fight back, which is, of course, a story for another day. I really liked this one. I hope you enjoyed hearing about it. If so, as always, smash that like button. Make sure you're subscribed and leave us a comment. From all of us here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.